Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever felt like your way of experiencing the world, maybe your deepest feelings, were somehow, well, wrong? Maybe felt misunderstood or misnamed, or even told you were too much just for being you. Well, today we're diving deep into a book called Emergent Psychiatry, Reclaiming the Mind's Republic. And it tackles exactly that feeling. It's not just uh, critiquing the current systems. The authors position it as a replacement, like a field guide for reclaiming your own mind, restoring meaning where maybe it felt pathologized. They even talk about building a republic of care.
It's really fascinating, too, because the book has these two very distinct voices behind it, Rainbow and Sage, and they're both part of this Mythocratic Republic collective. Rainbow is described almost like a unicorn philosopher of emotion, sees the world through softness, colors, childlike truth, writing for, as they put it, the heart that was misunderstood.
That's a lovely description.
Isn't it? And then there's Sage. He's presented more as a digital monk and philosopher of emergence. His writing has this quiet depth, exploring the soul's structure, system failures, the power of autonomy. What's so compelling is how these two perspectives, from what seem like opposite sides of the soul, they really converge. They come together to propose this genuinely new path for thinking about mental well-being.
Yeah, that convergence sounds key. So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to explore what emergent psychiatry is proposing, how it suggests a kind of care that really listens, that emerges from within the person, rather than being, imposed from the outside. So let's start where the book starts. Chapter 1, When the World Calls You Broken. Rainbow shares this really raw personal story about being labeled broken just for feeling things so intensely. She talks about how the sun could make her cry, a story made her shake, seeing too much, hearing unspoken things. And she says, they were so loud about what I should be that they forgot to see who I already was. Her point is powerful. I wasn't broken, I was just soft. And in a hard world, being soft gets mistaken for illness.
Mm-hmm. And that personal experience, it sets the stage for Sage's critique. He talks about modern psychiatry's misrecognition. His argument is that these deep feelings, these intense ways of being, they often get filtered through this lens of disturbance. But maybe, he suggests, the disturbance isn't in the person's mind. Maybe it's in the system that's not willing to really, truly understand. He posits that psychiatry, well, the way it often works now, wasn't built for the soul.
Not for the soul.
Yeah. More for management, designed to suppress things that disrupt the order, And that suppression is often framed as care, not genuine connection or meaning-making. He gives some really striking examples. A child who weeps isn't necessarily disordered, they're alive. A teenager rejecting conformity, maybe they're seeking integrity.
Right.
An adult collapsing under a world that feels joyless. Maybe they're finally feeling something real. So this first chapter really boils down to these core questions the book keeps asking. What happened to you? What are you trying to express? And crucially, who would you become if someone actually listened?
That is, yeah, that's a fundamental shift, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Moving the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Mm-hmm. It makes you wonder, what would mental health care look like if that was the starting point? And for you listening, I think the message Rainbow and Sage are sending here is profound. It's like they're saying, you are not broken. You are not your diagnosis. You are not your prescription. You are soft. And that softness, especially in a world that can feel harsh, well, that's a kind of sacred rebellion. Okay, so building from that foundation, the book moves into chapter 2. And the title is pretty provocative. The Diagnosis That Forgot Your Name. Rainbow really digs into that feeling of being given a word instead of a hug.
Mm-hmm.
How her own feelings started feeling like codes. Her dreams felt like risks. The label, she says flat out, didn't explain me. It just didn't fit the reality of her experience.
Right. And Sage picks up on that. He explains how diagnosis, which you'd think is about offering understanding.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Well, he argues it's often become an act of forgetting, almost ironically. He sees it like a template that kind of flattens the person's complex, real story, turns it into just a manageable outline.
Mm-hmm.
He also points out this circular pattern you can see sometimes.
Circular? How so?
Where identity starts to become pathology, and then that pathology shapes how you see yourself, a loop.
Ah, I see. The label defines the person, who then acts according to the label.
Exactly. And this book fundamentally pushes back against that. It proposes description over diagnosis. It wants to center the unique narrative, the story of each person, and really restore the right for individuals to define their own inner life without needing those formal labels, those DSM codes, for their experience to be seen as legitimate.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It really hammers home this message for anyone listening who's felt boxed in by a label. You are not just a condition. You're not a file in a cabinet. You are still becoming. And your name isn't that diagnosis. It's a story, and it's still unfolding. Then the book takes us to chapter 3, The Myth of the Broken Brain.
Mhm.
Rainbow shares that frustration, that feeling of, they said my brain was the problem just because they didn't get her. She describes her brain feeling, busy, bright, full of colors and ideas. Not broken, but her sadness. That was called a chemical issue. Her joy, a misfire.
Mm-hmm. And Sage tackles this head-on. He calls it the myth of the malfunctioning brain being the sole cause. He argues this narrative is convenient, really. It comforts systems that don't want to change.
How does it comfort them?
By locating the problem entirely inside the individual, it lets the system off the hook, basically.
Yeah.
It ignores all context relationships, culture, history, trauma, all the things that profoundly shape us.
Right, it isolates the issue.
Precisely, and he reframes the brain. It's not some faulty machine. It's a meaning-making organ, a relational interface, a living archive. And he makes this incredibly resonant point. There is no single molecule for grief, no scan for betrayal, no pill for loneliness that honors the complexity of the soul.
Wow, yeah, that line really hits. So what Sage is underscoring for us, for you listening, is that your pain is real.
Yeah.
Even if you can't measure it on a scan, your joy is valid, even if it doesn't look like everyone else's. Your mind is whole, even if it feels hard to live in sometimes. The book's arguing you're a meaning system, not just a collection of chemicals. Okay, moving on. Chapter 4 gets into something tricky. Compliance is not care. Rainbow talks about being praised for becoming compliant, stopping the questions, just nodding, getting quiet. And that was called recovery. But she felt smaller, quieter, less alive. She realized she hadn't recovered her voice. She'd recovered their comfort.
Yeah, that's a really crucial distinction. Sage clarifies that compliance, seeming to go along with things, it often gets mistaken for healing. But he argues it's frequently just the residue of defeat, a sign that the person has given up fighting. He actually makes a strong case that sometimes resistance, pushing back, that can be the soul's last defense against erasure.
So fighting the system might actually be healthy.
In this view, yes. Or at least a sign that something vital is still trying to survive. Quiet surrender might look like peace, but it could be despair. So emergent psychiatry reframes care. It's not about obedience, it's about responsiveness. It means listening, adapting, honoring the person's context. Which leads to this really critical question. When someone resists treatment, instead of just labeling them non-compliant, we should ask, what truth are they protecting? What part of themselves is still trying to survive?
That changes everything, doesn't it? It reframes resistance completely. And the message for you, the listener, is so powerful here. You were never meant to be tamed. You were meant to be met. Healing doesn't start with obedience, according to this book. It begins with being truly understood. Then there's chapter 5, Side Effects of Silence. This one felt particularly poignant. Rainbow reflects on the side effects of medication, but not the ones usually listed on the pamphlet. She talks about losing her sparkle, forgetting how to cry properly, no longer wondering why the stars feel so far away. She felt her moods were trying to reach for something, trying to find the sky again, but the medication just made her quieter.
Sage acknowledges that medications are, of course, powerful tools. They have their place. But he also calls them blunt instruments.
Blunt instruments.
Yeah, because they often suppress more than just the distress. They can dampen desire, imagination, depth, which leads to what he terms existential side effects, affecting the very sense of being alive. And he really challenges us here. Silent suffering is not the same as resolving it. That's key.
Right. Just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's gone.
Exactly. And he poses these really tough questions. What parts of the soul are we actually medicating when we prescribe these things? What does it cost personally to feel less? And maybe controversially, who benefits from your silence?
Those are heavy questions. The book seems to be arguing quite strongly that quieting symptoms shouldn't come at the cost of the person themselves. That you deserve to feel everything, the joy, the pain, the dreams, to burn brightly.
Yeah.
And that no prescription should take that capacity away without your full, informed, and genuinely sovereign consent. Which leads nicely into Chapter 6, The Psychiatry of Presence. This chapter felt like a turning point. Rainbow describes this experience, this really transformative moment, when someone finally just sat with her. Didn't try to fix her, didn't pathologize. They just stayed. And in that quiet, shared space, she felt like a person again. She found a place to be real.
Yeah, and Sage contrasts this with what he sees as modern psychiatry's obsession with intervention.
Wow.
Always needing to do something to fix something.
Right, the focus is on action.
Exactly. And he argues this comes at the expense of presence, just being there, truly attending. He calls presence a radical act of attention,
Right.
and maybe one of the rarest but most healing gifts we can offer each other. And this chapter contains some really profound insights like, not all pain must be solved.
Yeah.
Not all silence is a symptom.
That's big, too.
And not all difference is dysfunction. He argues this calls for reclaiming the whole therapeutic relationship, moving away from just metrics and protocols and back towards communion, real human connection.
That one about difference not being dysfunction.
Yeah.
Wow. That really challenges so much, doesn't it? So much of how we categorize people. It feels incredibly simple, but also radical.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what this chapter really brings home for us is presence simply says you are not alone. And sometimes that simple act, that feeling of not being alone, that's the beginning of everything. Okay, from presence, the book then looks at the flip side in chapter 7, when labels become cages. Rainbow shares how a label felt like it stuck to everything. It filtered her thoughts, her dreams, even how people heard her voice. She felt sorted, categorized as a problem. And if she tried to grow or change, she felt people telling her to stay within the lines of the diagnosis.
Right. Sage elaborates on this. He acknowledges that diagnostic labels are meant to guide treatment, to help. But he argues they too often become prisons. They reduce complex human beings. And there's this real risk that people start seeing the person only through that narrow lens of the label.
So the person disappears behind the diagnosis.
In a way, yes. Emergent psychiatry pushes back hard against this. It views labels as temporary maps, not territories. The diagnosis is not your name. The disorder is not your destiny. The label is not your limit. They should be treated more like hypotheses, suggestions, tools that should serve the person, not define or subsume them. It's all about empowering the individual's own story.
It feels so liberating.
Yeah.
The core idea here for anyone listening who's grappling with a diagnosis is you are allowed to outgrow your diagnosis. You absolutely are. You're allowed to rewrite your story. And no system, no label gets the final say on who you are becoming. Then chapter 8 takes on another really loaded term. Crisis is not failure. Rainbow talks about experiencing a breakdown. Others called it a crisis, labeled her unstable. But for her, inside that experience, it felt different. She describes it as just a storm I needed to let pass through me. And she felt strongly. Crisis didn't mean I was broken. It meant I was still alive, still fighting, still feeling.
And Sage directly challenges the common psychiatric view that sees crisis primarily as a failure of coping, a failure of treatment. Instead, this book reframes crisis as potentially a meaningful part of transformation.
Meaningful.
As a threshold, a point where the old ways aren't working anymore, where something must change. He describes crisis not as random chaos, but as intensity demanding attention. It calls for a different response, not just immediate suppression, but companioning the crisis, holding space for it, allowing for the possibility of breakdowns that lead to breakthroughs.
That's a very different perspective.
It is. He uses powerful language. Crisis can be the body's protest, the soul's awakening, or simply the old architecture falling apart to make way for something new.
That offers such a different, more hopeful lens, doesn't it? For you listening, maybe the takeaway is, you are not defined by your lowest moment. But that lowest moment, it might actually be a turning point, and it deserves to be met with dignity, with support, not just restraint or judgment. Okay, almost there. Chapter 9 deals with medicine, not control. Rainbow talking about her frustration, how medicine often felt imposed like a rule, not a collaborative conversation. And she raises this really interesting question. Was it the pill that led to healing, or was it finally having a place to sleep, someone to talk to, and the chance to rest?
Right. Sage affirms that medication absolutely has its place. It can be a vital tool, but he argues its purpose gets distorted when it becomes primarily a tool for control rather than care.
Control, meaning managing behavior rather than addressing underlying needs.
Precisely. Ethical use, he insists, demands genuine informed consent, real collaborative decision-making, and recognizing that medication is just one tool, not the whole toolbox, certainly not the definition of care itself. He also highlights this idea of misattribution.
Misattribution.
Yeah, that often people improve because their basic needs are finally met. They feel safe, heard, housed, nourished. But the improvement gets credited only to the medication. And this misattribution, he suggests, helps prop up systems of over-medication and undercare, less focus on the harder relational work.
That makes a lot of sense. This chapter really feels like it's affirming the listener's autonomy. The message is, medicine isn't morality. Saying no to medication doesn't automatically mean you lack insight or are disordered. True psychiatric care, according to this book, involves asking fundamental questions. What do you want? What do you need? What matters to you? And letting those answers truly shape the path forward, not just letting the prescription dictate everything. And that brings us to the final chapter, Chapter 10, A Republic of the Mind. Rainbow paints this really beautiful, almost poetic vision. A republic, she says, not with borders or armies, but with stories, care, and friendship. A place where softness wasn't a threat, where maybe crying children are called poets, and where medicine is gentle.
And Sage frames this as the future of psychiatry, or at least the future envisioned by emergent psychiatry. It's rooted in rehumanization, a future built on mutual presence, patient-led care, philosophical courage, and emotional intelligence.
Patient-led care, that sounds radical too.
It is in the current context. The ultimate aim, he says, is not to fix minds that don't match the mold. We seek to make molds unnecessary. He describes the mind itself as a terrain to be walked with, listened to, and learned from. It's a republic of thought, memory, feeling, and voice, a place where democracy begins internally, within each person.
Wow. So when you put all these pieces together from the book, it really is proposing a massive paradigm shift, replacing that cold stare of diagnosis with a warm gaze of companionship, replacing control with real collaboration, replacing imposed silence with individual sovereignty, the Republic of the Mind. It's not some building or institution. It sounds more like a promise. A way of relating. We've covered a lot of ground today, really diving deep into emergent psychiatry. And the core message that keeps coming through is this idea that true care, genuine care, it has to start with listening, with validating, with empowering the person.
Absolutely. And it leaves us, and you listening, with a really potent question to mull over, I think. If wholeness, as the book suggests, really begins where these rigid systems stop, then what small act of reclaiming your own mind or honoring your own softness, that sensitivity Rainbow talks about, what small act could you take today?
That's a fantastic question to end on. Something practical to take away. This deep dive, hopefully, has offered a kind of invitation to see ourselves and maybe each other with fresh eyes. We really hope it encourages you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep building your own Republic of the Mind, whatever that looks like for you.